Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, 5 critical controls for ICS OT cybersecurity. My name is Mary Lynn Gollier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Robert Lee, SANS Senior Instructor and author ICS 515 and FOR 578, and Tim Conway, SANS Senior Instructor and author ICS 456. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Mary. Well, we do not have a lot of time. So
yeah, we joked as we started this off that we have made mistakes. Tim and I normally can just talk to you all for an hour without slides. And now we have like 36 slides. But the good news is there was exactly initial registration, exactly 502 of you, which is a very Modbus TCP meaningful contribution to the ICS community. So we're off to a good start already. So with that, Tim, why don't you take us the backstory, and we'll try not to meander too much.
Yep, I'll get us moving quick. So this is a discussion topic that we've had for a very long time, and I went back kind of in history as our first mile marker. We had a webcast back in 2016, October, so about 6 years ago, where we had the same exact discussion of there's a lot of frameworks that are out there. There's a lot of guidelines and a lot of industry standards and requirements, but we continue to see a lot of sectors and organizations struggling in regards to just tell me what to do. And there's a history there that same exact thing has happened kind of in the IT space. And the answer to just tell me what to do there, as many of you are aware, kind of SANS worked with a lot of industry experts, came up with 20 critical controls. Those eventually kind of moved into the Center for Internet Security, CIS, and they've refined those down to the kind of top 18. So about 6 years ago, we had a discussion that said, which of those controls apply to ICS and how would you prioritize them? And that's what we did 6 years ago. A year ago in December, Rob and I were at CDI, and whenever we get together, we tend to first check in on family and each other in life. And then we start talking about what problems we're seeing with the different customers and sectors we work with. And we start talking about what can we do to make a difference. For Rob and I, without getting into too much of our background or history or past, we both have a passion and kind of a calling for this area. And we really do want to matter and make a difference in some way. We came to the discussion of why should we refine ourselves to the 18 critical controls and try to pick which ones apply to ICS, because ICS is frankly too different. We started working on this project and came up with what do we believe are the 5 difference makers, what's going to move the needle, what's going to matter for leaders and organizations and for practitioners and organizations. So we pulled this together, and there's a lot of things that are out there. So if you're an organization that's doing a whole bunch of stuff, you got your NIST, you got your CSF, you got your IEC 62443, your NERC sipping it, you're doing everything you could possibly do, and you're not looking for anything else, go ahead and disconnect. If you're an organization that is looking for a, hey, just tell me
starting this off right with, well, then screw you. No.
If you're one of the many organizations in many sectors that is saying, just tell me what to do. And we hear that from people that are doing all the things, because there's always a but. Like, we're doing NERC SIP, but it doesn't apply to distribution, or we're only doing it at the highs and mediums, or we're only doing it in this way. Or we're requiring 62443, but it's being implemented like this or being implemented like that, and we're still seeing problems and issues. So there's always a but, even if you're doing everything else. And for those organizations that aren't required to do something specific, there is a need and a call for action.
And here's my spin on that. No, we're not even gonna make it past one slide yet, Tim. Let's go back.
I'm on the next slide.
We're gonna get an hour into this, and it's gonna go like one slide. Anyways, here, from my point of view, everything that Tim just said, absolutely. But let me give you a different spin on it. You should be doing a framework. NIST 62443, one of them. Please go have a framework. It helps you. Just like MITRE ATT&CK is not about a bingo card. It's about having a lexicon to be able to communicate to your peers. So is the frameworks. And I need you to do this. And the frameworks have been very thoughtfully developed. But in my own experience in class or incident response case or whatever, number one is always, we find that almost always that organizations went the wrong direction to get to the end. What I mean by that is they thought about the architecture, they thought about prevention, they thought about all the different things that are very heavily focused in the standards. There's a prevention bias in a lot of the standards that when they actually got to the incident, nothing was aligned. They didn't have the right detections against the things they cared about, or the right response strategy, or the right collection of data to ever get there. So number one finding consistently is organizations that thought about incident response last as if it's the place to get to, instead of reverse engineering out what should a good incident response look like and using those lessons along the way. Number two, consistently, executives have a rosier view of their OT security program than reality to a massive level. So let's understand really what we're doing and why we're doing it. Number three, people use the frameworks because they are appropriate, but have no idea why they're doing things. And so what happens is we get in these almost moral or dogmatic debates. Is this a good control or bad control? Well, it's not ethics. It's not like it's a good or bad control. The question is, does this control actually reduce the risk that we're aligned on? And what we find is a lot of organizations don't get aligned on the risk. IT comes with their point of view, OT comes with their point of view, executives come with their point of view. So at the end of the day, we don't actually have an alignment on the actual requirements, and everyone's trying to piece in together their puzzle, and it leads to all of us getting frustrated and honestly gold plating the problem, putting too many security efforts. I'm tired of walking in and seeing a Gantt chart with 37 controls that they want to do across the next 5 years, and they don't get anywhere. So what Tim and I did is we looked at every single one of the ICS cyber attacks, just like you would do if you're going to take an intelligence-driven approach. And we charted them out through the ICS cyber kill chain and looked at, and we're going to show you some of the math here, if you will, but we looked at all of it and said, what controls consistently would have made a difference, a real big difference in those attacks, every single one of them. And these are the 5 controls we came to: ICS incident response plan, a defensible architecture, ICS network visibility and monitoring, secure remote access, and risk-based vulnerability management. We're going to walk through each one of these because bias is a heck of a drug, right? Bias means you tend to look at things through your own world lens, which means you could look at the things on the slide and go, oh yeah, that means all the stuff I'm already doing. Probably not. We're going to walk through how to think through these because we're not trying to be prescriptive. We're trying to be outcome focused. What do you mean by a defensible architecture? Well, it depends. What scenarios do you actually care about in terms of risk? So with that, Tim, maybe we go to the next one.
What?
Oh, go ahead.
A couple of things that I'll say up front because I know we're going to get questions on it. So number one, this presentation will be available online and recording. Along with it, the white paper that Rob and I wrote and was incredibly too long, into the 25 page count. We reduced it down into 15. It's getting beautified now, and then it'll eventually post. The paper will be posted with the webcast, and the paper will be posted on our white papers link, which is at the end of these slides. The other thing that I'll mention, so we don't have to mention it with each of the controls, is these controls all touch each other, meaning you don't think of this like a bowl of spaghetti. You don't think of it like a waffle. You're not going to go out and do like just one of these and stop there and end it and hope for the best. Each of these sort of touch each other, intertwine. The first two more than anything else as we work through IR and defensible architecture.
And there's an implied order. You will go in order of control 1, then control 2, control 3, et cetera, to get the most out of this. So let's start off with ICS incident response plans. All right.
Absolutely.
With an ICS incident response plan, the necessity of our operations environments is simply different than IT. So it is not about the technologies. And I constantly see people and they say, well, what's the difference between IT and OT? Well, they have these purpose-built controllers and these specialized protocols, and that's great. And that is true at a point in time. But there is convergence that's happened over the years where we have Windows operating systems on the side of an ABV RTU, right? So like, that's all fine. It's not about the technology. It's about the mission, the impact, the risks, and the threats that they face. All right. So it has nothing to do with just, oh yeah, they're different protocols. That's fine. But there's a different requirements out of that environment because it is a different mission and you have different threats. If your threats are different, your risks are different, your systems happen to be different, your mission is different, and the impact is different, you're not going to take your same controls. So it's not okay to have a big, robust IT incident response plan and then a little addendum. And here's how we actually take care of the entire reason we're in business. Nope, you got to have an ICS specific incident response plan. And it's not just going to be, here's my POC, this is who I talk to, this is who I call. That's important, but when you really build an incident response plan for ICS, you're going to think about the scenarios that you want to be able to respond to. And those scenarios are going to run it in sort of a playbook of, if this kind of thing happened to us, here's the way that we would respond to this. And it's never going to be perfect, but it's going to get you way further down the field than just having a point of contact at the plant and say, in case something goes wrong. Really important on these scenarios. And I know we're going to go through this in the next couple of slides, but to me, one of the most valuable things about these scenarios is, number one, they're real world scenarios. It's not, yeah, I watched this Black Hat talk and there was a vulnerability that allowed me to spin Bluetooth, and Bluetooth would spin the wind turbine back and it would blow up. The problem with doing that is, yeah, I'd love you to be forward looking, but if you go and invest in areas of risk that have not taken place, you're going to have a very difficult time getting executives and boards to sign off. Your shareholders really should not be comfortable with that at all. And the security you put in place against a scenario or a thing that's never happened may not actually be the security you're going to need if that real thing really manifests. So it's all kind of hypothetical. So the trick to this whole thing is, if you're in the oil and gas industry, what scenarios should you be dealing with? Well, everyone needs to be dealing with ransomware and operations. You're probably going to deal with a crisis-like scenario against safety systems. And then you could probably deal with something like pipe dream. If you're in the electric, what are you going to deal with? Ransomware and operations, 2015 Ukraine, 2016 Ukraine, pipe dream. You're going to find these scenarios, and that the real value of scenarios too, especially as we get outside of the security team, is it overlaps with how everybody else communicates. Your board of directors talks about revenue accounting and scenario planning for financial forecasting. They talk about benchmarking against other companies with scenarios. Your operations staff will talk scenario planning. If your safety culture, they'll have process hazard analysis or HazOps type scenario planning. Your security folks, kill chain analysis is essentially thinking through scenarios. It's not how do we stop VPNs or how do we stop, business email compromise. It's what's the scenario, and then let's design around that.
On this, from the ordering perspective, and we've mentioned that there's an order to implement these. This is one of those things that if you're kind of in a blue sky world and everything is perfect and nothing's going wrong, and you start thinking about how do we do security controls and how do we implement and how do we run a program from a leadership perspective, there's the normal common kind of what's in scope, what are our priority sites, and you start working through individual controls from perimeter to detection to a number of things that you see across these other frameworks that we've mentioned. And somewhere in there, you get down to sort of workforce and people and investing in staff, and incident response you'll find somewhere along the lines. As you know the scope of what you're doing, you have the people who understand how to respond, and then you have plans. In our case, where we've looked at cases that have happened in the past, often after an event occurs, then you will start to see a focus on incident response capabilities that are unique to OT in the environments that have been impacted, or the industrial control system or process space. And as we consider all these attacks that we've looked at from the past, from the perspective of if you're thinking about what should you be doing, this is an area where you need to start here, assuming that something may have already occurred or something may be occurring in the very near future. From a rapid response capability, going into an incident response without a thoughtful OT focused or ICS incident response plan is very, very chaotic. This is absolutely where you should begin. If you are an organization that is, your industry has already been attacked, kind of the sector that you're in and the various scenarios that Rob just walked through, if those are meaningful to you, you should absolutely be constructing a ICS focused IR plan and conducting exercises based on those scenarios. The approach that we'll reference here is kind of a 3-step approach for performing that. And that is similar to what Rob just walked through from the perspective of which scenarios pose the most risk to your process and to your operational environment. So getting a list of those things, and in the white paper, we provide a number of examples. Consider what the consequences would be if one of those scenarios occurred and what the adversary would need to do to achieve that impact and that conduct that attack. And then work through the development of a tabletop exercise to actually play out those scenarios within your organization to make sure you are identifying all the various parts of your org that would be involved in that response, and that you are prioritizing kind of what actions do we take that would reduce the impact of a successful attack against our process and our facilities. Rob, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
And so real straightforward. So we can eliminate all the bickering back and forth on teams of this is important, this is important, this is important. If I go to the board of directors and I say, should we be prepared for, if I'm an electric power company, 2015 Ukraine-like scenario, they should be saying yes. It's up to the security team to figure out what that means. But the alignment's got to come from the top, because that's what's going to allow IT and OT and everybody in between to get aligned as well. Of we agree on that scenario. That's what we're trying to get around. Those scenarios are going to be the real world attacks that have taken place. Again, scenarios, not, well, there's a real world way to manipulate Bluetooth. That's not what we're talking about. That's not an attack, and that's not a scenario. That's something that happened. You can have components, that's fine, but what has happened in your industry? When you find that you don't have a lot in your industry, in the paper we talk about the mining industry doesn't have as many attacks as an electric power company, okay, or as many attack scenarios as a petrochemical industry, just in terms of what we've seen before, or at least been able to prove before. Then number one, I would argue, okay, the mining company may not need the level of security that an electric transmission company needs. That's a perfectly fine statement to make. It may make you feel uncomfortable from a shareholder and societal perspective, may be valid. But to be proactive, especially when you don't have much to go off of, is important. And to be proactive would be to say, okay, well, you know what? Crisis took place. It modified a safety system in a petrochemical facility. We're not a petrochemical facility, but we do have safety systems. What would a crisis-like scenario look like in our organization? But now I can be overt to the board, executives, operations staff, et cetera, to go, this has not happened in our industry, but we think it's so critical because of the impact on life and safety that we're going to model this out. Do we all agree on that? You get the alignment before you go try to engineer the solution. Beyond that, that's when you consider those consequence-based scenarios. Again, I would want you to have whatever's realistic in your industry with intel first. Those are the ground truth reality. They have happened. You should be prepared for them. Usually it's going to be 2 to 4. Once you get through those, then there should be what's the 1 or 2 biggest consequences at our company anyways, and what would a cyber attack do to achieve that? And let's look through that as well. And what you're going to find is after you get past about 2 scenarios, you're going to get a lot of that trickle down effect. So we have a lot of things that you're doing that actually have value on 3, 4, 5, 6 different scenarios, or scenarios you've never even come up before. Then you do the tabletop exercise. And the tabletop exercise, again, is not just that point of contact. It's also going to get into collection. If we can go to the next slide of, what are we actually going to need in the incident? You're going to walk through a whole process of how would we contain? How would we identify? Do we even have the data to identify the attack? Hey, Ukraine 2016, we saw a misoperation of digital relays through the IEC 104 protocol. Do we even have data sets that would allow us to detect that, to ever activate the incident response? Because a lot of people will find that their incident response plan won't ever be activated until something goes boom, because they don't have the capabilities to ever see what's going on. How would we recover? What data are we going to need for reporting? If you're a public company, you may have security exchange laws. SEC is looking at updating 8K and 10K filings in terms of incident reporting. Do you even have the data to do the regulatory financial operations security work? Just to keep it going on to the next one, Tim, if you don't mind.
Hang on.
Go ahead.
The reference from, again, kind of often you will find in an organization, a incident response plan that they have and reference, and everybody goes through a document management system and checks off on. But the uniqueness to your industrial control system IR plan is very, very specific, and your response plan should be as well. So getting down the path of either a general ICS focused IR plan different than IT, or even process and facility specific IR plans based on how that facility is operated. Rob mentioned kind of some of the uniqueness of the identification phase and the recovery phase. I'll just mention from a containment and eradication, IT will focus on those in very different ways than OT. From a hunt, find, kind of remove, whereas in an OT plan, the initial focus will be on limiting or restricting the operational impact. So based on where an adversary is, what could they achieve, and how can you reposition the system that's under your control so that you can operate through the attack? And that becomes the focus. The traditional kind of containment eradication comes later. The how do you operate through an attack, understanding where an adversary is and what could they achieve or what could they manipulate, is extremely important and absolutely different than a traditional IT IR plan. I wanted to get coverage of all those things. The lessons learned is obvious. I think the only piece that we would add to that is they don't have to be your lessons learned. Learn from other people's events, other cases. Throughout the paper, we tried to highlight in each of these 5 controls some kind of lesson learned from another sector, from another entity, from a different event that you can pull from. You don't have to wait for your attack to learn from it. You don't have to wait from your tabletop exercise to learn from it. You can learn from the community and from each other. All right.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. So that gets again down. Figure out your scenarios. You're going to use papers like the ICS cyber kill chain. You can lean on papers like the sliding scale of cybersecurity just to think about the buckets of efforts you can do. You're going to want to have an architecture, passive defense, and active defense outcome for each step that the adversary can take. That's where you're going to get this kind of defense in depth mindset that's tailored to what you need. But throughout this presentation and throughout the white paper, you'll see references to other white papers. And in many ways, this is a culmination of what Tim and I have been working on for years in ICS 515 and 456 and so forth. The papers we've written, the work we've done, it's all kind of coming together. And you know what? Here's the 5 controls, and here's how you leverage all the stuff we've been talking about. So for those of you who have been paying attention for the last decade, a lot of this is going to sound very thematically aligned because this was the direction kind of we were always going in the community. So next slide.
I have one comment on each.
Right.
This one will be even briefer than the
I'm
last.
trying my best to keep us on track.
I know.
For once.
We're still in control 1. This will be briefer. The only thing that I've seen over the years that Rob has mentioned with these types of approaches is often people look to stage 1, corporate, into their kind of enterprise pivoting into their industrial control system space over and over again. That ends up being kind of the blinder view. The one thing we're going to talk about when we get into defensible controls and remote access and everything else is this initial stage 1 intrusion doesn't have to be your corporate and your enterprise environment. It can be a third party, a system integrator, or a vendor as well that has trusted paths into your space. So think broader when you see stage 1, doesn't have to be your corporate enterprise. All right.
All right. So one of the things that's also going to come out of the incident response planning phase is going to be the development of a collection management framework that you need. It will not necessarily be the collection management framework you have. This is another paper I wrote that we link in, but a collection management framework, a CMF, essentially states what is the type of asset, what data comes off of it, where is it stored, and for how long. All right. So if I look at Dragonfly, which was the Havex malware and was used for espionage across a wide range of petrochemical, pharmaceutical, mining, electric companies, if I look at that, one of the techniques that they were using was ICS port scanning on common protocols or common ports and enumerating tags via OPC. All right. So they could do that. Well, great. If you wanted to identify, prevent, detect, and respond to that tactic and technique, what are the relevant data sources? And you'll find things like network traffic analysis with a capability in OPC is going to be really important. You're going to find legitimate ICS installers. You're going to want those Windows events off of certain assets. Too many people go into industrial environments like corporate environments and go, give me the logs. Like, what logs? All of the logs. All you're going to have now is an overabundance of data that you don't know what to do with it, and you're going to drown in the data. Instead, the point here is, what would I need to be able to detect and respond to these type of incidents, these type of scenarios? What is the minimum data I should be collecting, and of what types and for how long? Then that is a playbook as you go out to your defensible architecture to implement it. That'll be control 2 that we get to in a second of how do I need to implement this environment? There are a lot of cases that we take in the incident response phase that organizations will never be successful because the architecture simply does not support the data they need to get to answer the questions. So knowing upfront what scenarios do I need to get aligned on, and what data am I going to need to actually get through that scenario and to detect that scenario in the first place, that's going to architect out a CMF for you that you can go implement as a minimum requirement across the facilities that you find to be in scope.
Absolutely. So as you build your OT control 1 for IR, unique IR plan for OT environments and ICS space, unique scenarios based on your specific sector, and consider if you're only going to do one of them, you're probably not going to achieve a great deal. You need to do these exercises and scenarios on a recurring basis where you're constantly improving, constantly adjusting. And as you make investments in the rest of these controls, the way you run your scenarios and the way you do your incident response exercises and tabletops will change based on these actions. So it's not a one and done kind of a situation. We are at our second control.
Boom, about halfway through.
Defensible architectures.
So what is a defensible architecture? Fundamentally, it is an architecture that helps eliminate as much of the risk as possible that you don't want to deal with, while enabling the human defenders to make it a defended architecture. There is no such thing as a secure system. There is no such thing as a defended system without the human component. So as an example, if I identify that ransomware in operations is one of my scenarios, then I will find things like, well, a lot of the ransomware cases or the population or the progress and the proliferation of ransomware from an Active Directory server that's being shared between IT and OT. So it's not air gap your networks because you're not going to be able to outside of nuclear power plants. It's not going to be worse segmented, which means a lot of things to a lot of people. It's going to be the Active Directory needs to be segmented in this environment against this scenario so that GPOs and similar cannot be pushed down and populate ransomware across my environment. That would be the requirement now. Now that's something actually tangible for your architecture people and your system architects instead of go make it secure, which means nothing. Okay. So you're going to look at what would the architecture support. You're talking network traffic analysis. Guess what? You're going to want span ports or tap infrastructure at the facilities that are in scope for the incident response. So you're going to think about what are the characteristics that this architecture has to support. Then you're going to map it back to 6243 or NIST cybersecurity framework or NERC or whatever else. You don't want to do it in the reverse because it's not a bingo card. You want to figure out what does my architecture need to support, and then I'll map it to the frameworks that we're going to use as a communication tool.
Yep. As you look towards kind of the segmentation means many things to many people. You could be talking routing, you could be talking perimeter defense, you could be talking VLANing. As we sort of work through this, who defines segmentation, you look at various standards requirements, you often tend to see kind of the investment at the edge pointed outward. So defending against attacks from corporate, from business, from enterprise environments with very little controls and very little segmentation or defensible capabilities and architectures within an ICS space, with very little ability to kind of segment out based on risk Active Directory and do collection and do kind of logging and monitoring and alerting and the architecture that will support all of the rest of the controls that we are going to talk about in this webcast and we talk about in the paper. Often you see kind of these perimeter outward facing, and that is where the investment goes. And at a leadership level, you will hear people, we talk to our cybersecurity teams and they've told us that we're firewalled off. We're completely separated from corporate and from business, or that attack only impacted IT. It had no impact on ICS because they're completely separated. As you kind of hear those words and you hear that language, really getting into the architectures and really understanding, did it only impact IT because that's all the adversary chose to do? What could the adversary have done based on the position they had if they chose to go deeper?
And if I could double in, there's plenty of times that we're told it's IT only impacting incident. And the reality is it's in operations as well, but you didn't have the visibility, you didn't have the response plan, you didn't have anything. So operations people are just doing what they can around it, or definitional differences. We've had instant response case where people are like, yeah, it's just impacting IT. What IT? Just all these Windows PCs that are these weird like applications that operate the gas turbine. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's OT, so get out of that mindset and realize, yeah, we've got to get into the environment because that's where you're getting protected. But Tim, as you build out the slide, I think has an even better point around that. For sure. Your IT.
Yep. Attacks could be coming from within, could be coming from environment to environment. There's a number of kind of trust zones that spread from one unit, one control area to the next. As we move into the control on remote access later, you will see kind of third-party, site-to-site, vendor OEM connections direct in. And really, this is where kind of this defensible architecture needs to exist in order for you to do things like network visibility, detection, monitoring, logging, collection, remote access controls, vulnerability management. This control will absolutely touch and enable all of the other controls. So there may be an answer at a site of based on risk, what you need to do from a defensible architecture perspective that differs from another site, And you really need to understand the unique risks that will all be informed by the IR control that we talked about as the first. Anything left on this one before we go to number 3?
Nope, that's it. But again, too many people have indefensible architectures. I feel a lot of times when we take incident response cases, it's almost therapy. to walk people through just how bad things are. I don't want to be jaded and I don't want to be cynical. I mean, kind of anything but cynical, but I don't want to be too crispy with everybody. But I've walked through enough of these incident response cases. For every one you hear in the media, we're doing 20 or 30 behind the scenes. And life is not good right now, but it could be. Like, defense is doable and we can dominate the adversary. But when we're fooling ourselves about the actual status of our environment, it's not doing anybody any good. Yeah. So let's go on to the next one.
We need to create like a the addict coin of the 5 critical controls for the defense is doable.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we are on control 3 and we are halfway through the webinar, so we're doing good.
Good. All right. I'm gonna take the first shot at this one because this is where I live these days. A lot is network traffic analysis. Yep. Number 1, why do we put so much focus on network traffic analysis in ICS? Is it because, well, it's easy to deploy in passive system in comparison to endpoints because of vendor warranties and so forth and so on? Nope, that's not it. In IT, a major focus of security is on data security and system security. This is an overgeneralization, but I find it to hold pretty true. System security, data security. If my intellectual property or my system, my PII, my data is leaving my corporate environment, that's bad. So I want to protect the data, encrypt it in transit, encrypt it in rest, DLP solutions, whatever else. And systems are really important. We live a lot on Windows systems, sometimes Mac, sometimes Linux, but a lot of Windows environments. So if Microsoft pushes an update to Microsoft Windows system and it enables a remote code execution vulnerability that just automatically enables off like a Word application, like, oh God, life is ruined for people for a while. Makes it easy to access. You can escalate privileges. You can do all the fun stuff, and boom, your data's stolen. Your systems are impacted. That's IT. That's not OT. In OT, it's systems of systems and physics. I don't really care what you can do with any one system. I can give you physical access to a human machine interface and say, now make the lights blink. And that may still not do it for you. So I need to know, how is system 1 impacting with system 2 that manifests a physical reality on system 3? That system to system analysis is going to be network traffic. It's how is the HMI sending the 61850 command to the relay? How is the engineer workstation using Honeywell Experion's protocol to interface the PLC to be able to reprogram the logic on it? That system to system analysis is why there's such a focus on network security monitoring and the network. You can add host based in. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with hosts, but that's why the huge focus in OT is, because of the nature of the system to systems. It better be ICS protocol specific. This is the piece that's, when I teach classes, one of the things that really trips up IT security people the most first, and as they get into the journey of becoming OT security people, which is just the most beautiful thing to watch. We come from a background in IT to think about vulnerabilities and exploits and malware. Some of the most consequential attacks out there, some of the most consequential risks out there to operations is not exploits and vulnerabilities. It's somebody knowing how to operationalize the system or misoperate the system in a malicious way. If I can open up a circuit breaker, I can close a circuit breaker. If I can program a safety system to have set points where it trips, I can program it where it doesn't. And so there's a lot of native functionality. Sometimes people call it insecure by design. I don't really agree with that as much. It is exactly the design it is supposed to be to operate the system, but it can be misoperated. So you need to understand, is somebody misoperating my system, whether it's a contractor, an insider, or an adversary? And that's going to require things like ICS protocol specific views, so you can understand what's happening in the command protocols, not just, yeah, Modbus TCP is being used. No, it's, oh yeah, it's changing a set point on that valve or that system that controls the valve. That's a bad thing in runtime operations. So we're going to figure out, what is the visibility required in our environment to reinforce the defensible architecture? Because we put a lot of eggs in that basket of, this is our defensible architecture. Okay, well, let's monitor it. First use case out of this is not even just pure security. It's just, let's make sure the prevention that we have doesn't atrophy over time. So let's assess the architecture continuously to make sure we're okay. Second use case is going to be, what are the tactics and techniques of the adversaries that matter in the incident response scenarios that we came up with? I've seen a lot of companies go, cool, we're going to monitor all the alerts. We're going to send everything to a SIM, look at the alerts and triage them all. And then you just drown in the data. Tier 1 analyst doesn't even know what to look at. But if you were to tell them, out of all the different tactics and techniques, and we have slides coming out for this, out of all the other tactics and techniques out there, these 20 matter for our scenarios. If you see these 20, let us know. Now we can make this scalable. Now we can make this something we can teach people about, instead of find every anomaly. What? Like, there's a lot of anomalies that happen in an industrial environment. Okay. It's not these static, simple networks that people like to believe. So we're assessing our architecture. So critical control 3 is validating critical control 2 continuously and It's making sure that we can detect the things that get us to the control 1, the incident response plan. And you're going to see where it also impacts control 4 and 5 here in a second.
Yep. I think one thing we actively talked about as we were selecting this is, number one, it had to be there. Number two, priority of where it goes. Number three, how are people going to view it based on Rob's day job from the perspective of where it's coming from.
Follow me out, Tim.
I can assure you, this is not driven by companies that he runs, and it's the opposite. It's the importance of this is what has driven the company to exist. It's the reason this needs to exist in our critical infrastructure spaces and places is why there's a number of organizations that have products and solutions in this space.
Yep.
All right.
Good. All right. So again, not just an inventory. I see this all the time. I want an asset inventory. For what? Well, I got to know everything. What do you need to know? Let's go back to those scenarios. Hey, I got to know where our digital relays are if I care about Ukraine 2016. Hey, I got to know where engineer workstations are if I care about an SIS scenario with Trisis. What is the requirements is going to drive what we need out of our inventory and the topology of it. How are things connected? How are they communicating? That's going to allow me to take a better approach to validating the architecture and detecting threats. And really key, I'm not going to collect things I don't need. I see folks going out going, hey, I need the firmware version on that relay. Cool. Are you going to patch it? Are you going to do anything with it? Are you going to do anything whatsoever with that data? Well, no, but we need the inventory. Don't go collect things that you don't have a use case for, because you're just going to piss off operations. Okay. You're going to spend your resources and you're going to take your time. You're going to piss off operations going and collecting things that you're not going to use. Your scenarios drive what visibility you need, what inventory, what topology, what commands that you need to be monitoring for, what you need to know. And again, getting to the TTPs, those tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary. So next slide, I want to bring this all in the flavor. So MITRE ATT&CK developed the MITRE ATT&CK, or MITRE developed MITRE ATT&CK for enterprise, and then they came along and developed MITRE ATT&CK for ICS. These are the known tactics and techniques that have been used in ICS attacks. This world of 81 tactics, techniques, and procedures is the known world. Okay, it's a great place to start. But I don't want you to go, again, play bingo and try to hit all 81. Even though there's 81, the reality is you can develop thousands of different detections per one. There's analytical breadth, which how many do I have? There's analytical depth. How many detections do I have per? And that'll be a long cycle that you're going to go through. So instead, next slide, what you'll essentially do is pick those scenarios. In this case, I clicked on Xenotime. And Xenotime is the adversary that conducted the Trisis attack against the safety system and the petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia in 2017. So if that scenario matters to me, I can go, cool, these are the highlighted ones are the tactics and techniques that matter in that scenario. So now as an organization, I'd want to know, cool, engineer workstation compromise. What does that mean to me? Well, that was step one, figuring these things out, which is going to drive that collection. It's going to drive the defensive architecture. It's going to drive, I need detections on these tactic techniques in that visibility and monitoring phase. These are the things that I deal with. Now I can take a tier one analyst and like a SOC or security operations kind of structure and say, hey, if you ever see the detections that are mapped to this, all right, these detections, when you see these, here's the playbook for it of escalation to the tier two. All right, it's not every single ICS alert. It's the ones we care about. Here's how you handle them. Then your tier two operations focused security team can go and take a look and go, cool, here's what that means in context of our environment. And if this is worthwhile or important enough, and now I know how to deal with it. So you're creating this structured escalation path that actually allows for everybody's expertise to come to bear instead of monitor all the things, detect all the things, triage every alert. And what will eventually happen if you do that is people will just do indicators against the data. If they don't see anything, they move on because they got 20 million other things to do. And if you're dealing with ICS cyber attacks, indicators in the ICS, not the biggest value. Indicators in enterprise to look for early warning signs, sure. But the actual event that's going to happen, TTP overlaps will definitely be there. But don't expect to find the hash or domain or whatever of the latest ICS malware in your environment. It's going to be tailored to your environment.
Like Rob mentioned, kind of you're not targeting coverage of all of these things, and neither is MITRE trying to cover everything that could occur, meaning this isn't selling certainty. This isn't your attack will look like this, an adversary is going to do this in this stage, then this in this stage, then this. This is what has been seen. This is what has been done. These are the different types of things and all they can do. Having appropriate detection and have within multiple enterprise. So starting at the top, this is where we see most. If you're talking to an organization that is saying, hey, we put in detection, we put in visibility. And in many cases, it is at that highest, most perimeter, corporate, business, enterprise, and they're assuming that will inherit some level of protection down. Or if there's an organization that has a team that has sort of been tasked with monitoring of the industrial control system space, you will see it at this kind of DMZ level or level 3, where they're at that point of demarcation doing some detection in and out. Where we are moving towards with this critical control is moving inward, so that you have more detection and more visibility within that space, so that you have an idea of what's happening within your environment that an adversary could leverage. ICS specific threats, ICS specific kind of adversary behaviors. As MITRE had created the attack and the attack for ICS, there are different behaviors and different actions between those environments. You think of your environments differently, so do adversaries, meaning IT, you're focusing on kind of the data that is used to manage your business. In your OT and ICS segments, you are focused on the systems and why you're a business. Adversaries do the same. So from an adversary attack approach within kind of the IT enterprise, they are gathering data, gathering information. If they have a goal of impacting your business and impacting operations, they are behaving differently when they get into your OT or ICS space. Therefore, their behaviors and their actions would look different. Your detections need to look different. You need to have more capability for ICS specific protocols. You have to have different collection points within this environment, not just the Windows systems. Within kind of ICS, you're looking for adversary information collection, manipulation, validation, actions. And that may occur across these types of things that we highlight on the slide, whether it's engineering workstations, gathering data to conduct a misoperation, or potentially validating commands to and from different devices. As you continue to move down this environment, you may see things that you wouldn't detect from above. You wouldn't detect from kind of your corporate business IT if that's the only place you have a solution. You wouldn't detect from possibly your demarcation point, your DMZ, where you have a SOC that's getting that data set. Now you're starting to see potentially system integrator driven or supply chain driven attacks and attack vectors and compromise, direct access paths from directly connected OEMs that are not working their way down through your architecture. They're directly connecting into a process environment. As you start to see kind of those alternate attack paths and alternate delivery methods, you will not have any visibility to that if you are not uniquely putting solutions in based on this critical control down in these additional industrial control system levels.
I want to hit that point really clearly. There are plenty of places that we go and we see monitoring solutions from vendor X, and they're deployed outside the substation or outside the plant because IT and OT have clashes, or the northbound firewall on the other side of the plant. And you're monitoring north and south traffic, what comes in or leaves the plant, substation, factory floor, et cetera. But all this stuff that actually matters for the visibility in the architecture, all this stuff that matters for the TTP detection, all that is east-west traffic analysis, meaning what's happening between level 2 and level 1, because it's usually a flat network, what's happening between the controllers. So you got to get down in those locations to monitor. It is not appropriate to start with north, south, and end there. You have to get down to see what's going on. And if you do it correctly, and we've got case studies in the paper to show this, you will actually start benefiting operational resilience as well. You'll start to see misoperation. You'll start to see contractors make mistakes. You'll start to see failing IO cards, battery packs on PLCs. You'll see mistakes that are happening, and you'll be able to help get root cause analysis to return a higher mean time to recovery or reliability profile for the operations staff. And they'll view your fancy security efforts as operational resilience efforts, and you'll be welcome at those sites.
The last element here before we move on, well, we have a couple more slides just in the goal of this, but we didn't want to leave out as we work through these levels, some environments moving towards digital elements at sensor level, at all levels of this architecture. And as that occurs, there's obviously a need and a benefit from ingesting traffic everywhere that it exists, ingesting signal, ingesting data, and anything that can inform a system that understands that process and operational environment, and any means of doing it, where you may be able to ingest from the process itself, from the systems and applications that exist, from a historian, wherever you can see that data and it can inform a responder, and it can inform somebody who understands the operational environment, and they can detect when something is out of band or misused or misoperated, or new commands are coming from a place they shouldn't, or new data is coming from a place that it shouldn't. That exists at all levels. This isn't something that is just routable TCP only at level 2. We are talking wherever these solutions go, and you can look at system modifications, calibration changes, scaling factor changes. Any of those things can help be a behavior or an indicator that you can fire on, and you can have a playbook or something that you respond to.
So long as it aligns the scenario you got in critical control 1.
Sure.
I'm going to have to jump on this one real quick to say there's a lot of like monitor level 0 for what? What would you like to accomplish? But there's data than them there hills. Okay, I got it. There's data. But what do you want to be able to accomplish? Otherwise, you won't accomplish anything. Okay. So I'm not a big monitor level 0 fan. I'm more of a fan of when it's IP, it's cyber. There's going to be there's a kinetic effect that can be achieved through cyber. There's a lot of like, can you monitor signals? You can do a lot of things. It doesn't mean it's a pound for pound good return on investment. But depending on your scenario, there's some in the nuclear power industry, as an example, that have some very interesting scenarios. And at that point, that'd be pretty interesting to look at some of those data sources. But please don't jump to the really hard stuff that is useful in one scenario without doing the really important stuff that's useful in 3, 4, 5 year scenarios.
Absolutely. All right. The main goal of all these things, obviously, I wish this wasn't a build slide. Sorry, Rob. I'm gonna get
Technically, that was 10 slides we just went through. We are
yeah. Main goal of all these things is what you see in between. So the top line, the top row is sort of the adversary actions. The bottom is kind of where you have controls, where you're doing detection, where you're from a defense perspective. These 5 controls we're talking about is trying to move you towards every way possible, prioritizing how do you reduce the time of compromise to detection? How do you reduce the time of detection to containment? How do you reduce the time of containment to remediation? Those gaps that exist right now without these critical controls, they are too long, especially in process and operational environments. We need to take every step we can take to reduce them. These 5 are prioritized to do precisely that. Any comments there before we move on?
Nope, go for it.
This one, as I've seen and kind of taught through class, a number of folks that are going out and looking at doing bake-offs and selecting products, and far too long I've heard we bought solution X and it didn't work, or it wasn't detecting things, and we've sort of built over time this kind of this scaling factor of, well, what was the issue with the solution? What type of data were you ingesting and doing acquisition of that you were able to provide it? So what were you expecting from the technology or the tool if you were only providing host files after an incident, or you had a unique network tap that you were using for troubleshooting? You had some network switch span port visibility. As you move to the right on that x-axis, you kind of see the more data that you can acquire, the more you can ingest that is actually usable to help inform the solution that you provided. Then you can start working through training your staff on the y-axis of how to actually understand that, what it means, what actions you should take, and start to kind of look at those 2 things to say, based on our threat, based on our risk at a site, based on the data that we can acquire, based on the staffing and the team that we're going to use, or managed service providers, what do we expect out of this? And is it just to help us inform incident investigation and response and kind of see where that is on this chart? Or is it to help us possibly perform threat detection and analysis? Or is it more of a overall cybersecurity management where we're doing those other things, but it also helps us look for things that aren't attacks, misconfigurations, modifications, other things that could potentially help inform and prevent some operational event? As you probably heard Rob say a number of times, there are more kind of misconfiguration related outages than there are adversary driven. So you kind of look at these solutions and your maturity and your capability, and that answer of what you should pursue and how you should implement it will be unique per process, per site, per facility, and should be informed by what the risk is at that site. Rob, anything before we move on to the fourth? You good? All right. Yep. 10 minutes, 2 controls left. This is the easiest.
Remote access. Yeah, this is super easy. So there's a lot of folks that understand that they need remote access, multi-factor authentication, whatever else they're going to put around it. One of the big challenges is if you don't follow the ordinality of the controls, you don't know what the scenarios are, you don't know what your defensible architecture is, you don't even know your inventory and topology, you're going and applying secure remote access with zero idea of what you have. So the reason it's number 4, even though it's a very important control, is you kind of got to know what you're doing and what you have first. Otherwise, you're just going to leave legacy VPN and remote access and stuff open. So without the visibility piece, you won't know where to apply the secure remote access. At this point in time, multi-factor authentication is the best approach for secure remote access where you can in terms of secure control. It will change over time. That's why I said secure remote access and not MFA. I'm not trying to be prescriptive. Use complex passwords until you don't, right? So we don't want to get locked into this is the today's thing. Secure remote access means find the remote access that you have, figure out what you actually need. You'll be able to turn off a lot of it. There's a lot of remote access you have you simply don't need. Then figure out what and blasted in chat. Why is ordinality so hard to pronounce? Because I'm from Alabama. Okay, like just calm down, Sam. But anyways, like English might as well be my second language. Okay, just calm down now. Calm down. You're welcome that I spelled these things right on the slide. Anyways, I love our community. Anyways, so ordinality is appropriate for the controls because you know what you have before you start applying the secure remote access. But you'll find that you can turn a lot of it off, but you will have to have it. Again, for those of you that are going, yeah, but we're segmented and we're completely air gapped, your operations people aren't talking to you. Okay. You can't run certain gas monitoring systems without bidirectional access. You can't run certain DCS solutions these days without bidirectional access. You will find that there are some things you don't need bidirectional access for. And there will be solutions that just give a one-way view. That sometimes that's going to be okay. But sometimes you'll find that that's not possible. And you're implementing a big control today that you're going to rip out in 3 years because the direction of the business is to go more digital and more hyper-connected and more digital transformation. So figure out the direction of the business, figure out the scenarios, figure out your inventory and kind of environment, then do the secure remote access. Where you can't do things like MFA, you're just going to design better implementations of your defensible architecture. You're going to put compensating controls and go, you know what? We can't put MFA there. Therefore, I'm going to create a jump host with an extra zone that has some additional monitoring, and I'm going to be risk reduction there. That's the right way to think about this, Tim.
All right, I'm going to go through these quick. We would have liked to have left this control off the list, but this is a major problem for ICS and continues to be so. If you look towards Ukraine 2015, the ability and the targeting of VPN remote access. You look towards VPN filter attacks and using the perimeter devices as a pivot point. You look towards the remote access and support tools of Oldsmar, and you look at even if you're an organization that did what we're talking about here, and you've gone out and done MFA across the board, but you didn't remove your legacy system. You look towards the colonial remote access paths. This is something that continues to emerge as an issue for industrial control system environments. And it is an issue that has gotten worse as you look towards the need for remote access being driven for COVID. And now we are operating a number of critical infrastructure environments in ways that we would have never allowed in the past. But now it is necessary from a reduction in other risks of human health and safety and issues introduced by the pandemic. Enabling remote access and secure remote access is a reality that we are not going to get rid of. And as it continues to increase and it continues to grow in a number of different ways, and we have reliance on external systems, we absolutely need to do it in ways that are secure. We need to focus on the uniqueness of ICS as well. So as you consider traditional approaches used in a IT, getting access into a corporate enterprise environment, kind of multi-factor authentication, getting to an intermediate server or a jump host, and then that becomes your point that you are then gaining access from, and that is what you're securing. This is sort of what we would expect for critical sites, critical facilities where remote access is happening, but it can't just stop there. That can't just be the, well, we've done what best practices exist in IT. You need to acknowledge the uniqueness of ICS environments where you have a number of trusted connections in at the operational level, from site to site, from vendor to vendor, from OEMs directly accessing these systems. And it's where your defensible architecture from Control 2, it's where your visibility from Control 3, all tie together with this remote access capability in Control 4 of what is unique to ICS. This can't just be your multi-factor for support personnel, for vendors, for remote workers that's connecting down through enterprise. You also have to consider all these east-west connections and remote access and trusted external paths. Anything, Rob, before we go to the last control?
Last one, 5 minutes. And for those of you that are asking questions, I'm answering them all in the chat over here. We've gone through about 20 of them, so keep asking because we're not going to have open Q&A at the end, just one time. Cool. Risk-based vulnerability management. I'm going to give you the flippant answer. I'm going to give you the real answer. The flippant answer is vulnerability management made in the 5 critical controls, because if I didn't have it, some CSO would have a heart attack. All right. But the real answer is some vulnerabilities matter, just not as many as you think. Okay. So sometimes patching will be necessary, but what you'll find in most cases, it'll be a mitigation, turning off a port or service, working with operations to make a firewall change. Most times you're going to do a mitigation that's not patching. The unfortunate reality is a lot of the patches that get released don't even actually mitigate the underlying vulnerability. They just mitigate like the proof of concept code or something else. So there's a lot of false hope and idols in patching in ICS. Not always, but quite often. But the most important thing here is, what does risk-based vulnerability management mean? It means the things that map back to those scenarios, not you think it's a risk, because that's where we all clash. Everyone says, let's be risk-based. And then what everybody in security views as risk is everything. Turns out, if COVID has taught us nothing, we all suck at risk management. Okay. So like, just dial it down a little. What do we actually need to solve for with vulnerabilities as it relates to our scenarios? And you're going to find a simple equation for this. And Tim's got some flowcharts, because every ICS presentation needs a flowchart. But the simple little Bobby Alabama version of this is, does the vulnerability introduce net new functionality that is not already available in the ICS, or is it already being actively exploited, or does it allow access into the ICS? If it meets one of those 3 criteria, it's probably going to be a key vulnerability for you. Okay. As an example, there was a vulnerability that came out years ago that people freaked out about, that if you were on an engineer workstation and a user clicked this very specific link, that it would give them remote access to be able to modify the logic on a PLC. And I was like, are you kidding me? One, how are you going to get this unique link to the operator? But most important, the whole point of an engineer workstation is to modify logic on a controller. You do not need a vulnerability to accomplish that. So everyone was freaking out about this vulnerability that was native functionality. It was pointless. You should be so lucky to have your adversary be so stupid as to use a vulnerability instead of native engineer workstation logic, programming software. So instead, focus on things that drive risk. As an example, can it cause a loss of view or loss of safety or loss of control that's not normally resident in that environment? Yeah, that's going to matter. Is it being actively exploited, or is it allowing us in, like a remote code execution vulnerability and a historian that's bridging the IT to OT divide, and now they've got access to OT? Well, that's pretty key. When you do that analysis, like my other day job team does that analysis every year, and we publish a report out to the community, and we find 4% of all of the ICS vulnerabilities match that criteria. 4%. So when you go to operations, instead of here's all these ICS vulnerabilities, you should be able to say, hey, I'm keeping 96% of the crap off your plate by doing the analysis and understanding our operations. I'm going to come to you, though, every now and then on this 4%. And when I do, I need your help around the mitigation. That's how you build culture between those organizations, instead of saying, here's a bunch of vulnerabilities, this is impactful, when they're busy trying to run the plant and keep our society running. Okay, that's the value add in security. Next slide, or whatever you want to add to, Tim.
Yep, I'm going to try to land this plane. A couple of slides. So this is the flow chart Rob was talking about out of ICS CERT. The discussion along the lines of this main path is kind of the risk of, do you address the vulnerability? Is addressing the vulnerability, does it impose a greater risk to operations? This piece up here this has progressed significantly over time. And it's where the discussions that Rob just had would come into play. Meaning, is the vulnerability something that is inherent to the process? Meaning, if from an engineering workstation or from a specific application, could the adversary get new capabilities, or is it there already? Does the vulnerability give them anything additional? Those types of discussions and decisions would happen up here and help inform this risk. And again, all of the other controls and the data sets and the mitigations and the compensating measures and everything that you have that is part of your active and your passive defenses, those things would also help inform this. Is the operational risk and the operational need greater than the risk of this vulnerability? This process, while it hasn't changed in many years since ICS CERT first put it out, as your environments mature and as you have more information to make decisions and inform, this part has changed. As you pursue the other 4 critical controls, this part up here that will inform this decision will change. This is what Robin mentioned in regards to 77% of these things that the analysis done in the Dragos year in review report all sort of pointed towards having access to the industrial control system environment, having the ability to deliver, having the ability.
There's a lot of vulnerabilities out there that are like, if you have physical access to the PLC, you can reset its path. Sure. It's like, yeah, and you can unplug it, jiggle the wire, anything else. So like, I don't want to be too flippant here, but just in the interest of time, we beat up people in the security community over vulnerabilities. And I'm not saying they're worthless, but they are one of the least valuable security risk reduction methods. And it's like the first thing people want to talk about. So it's the 5th one for a reason. Map back to your scenarios, follow that process. Does this matter or not? And do our other compensating controls already mitigate the risk? I'll see companies deploy antivirus and application whitelisting on the same system. They're like, it's defense in depth. No, it's not. Like you're just doubling up on controls on something instead of actually adding risk reduction to the overall view. Next slide.
All right. So this,
boom.
This is in summary, these controls, best practitioners out there trying to go make things happen. They need top level support. They need funding. They need staffing. This isn't just a project to finish. This is a process to own. In order to achieve these 5 things, you will likely need to know where you're going to go do them, some level of scoping. You will likely need some prioritized kind of joint response plan that's informed by all the relevant parties, including operations, engineering, not just IT and OT security. You will need to know sort of alignment on the risks. Who's deciding from a leadership perspective, what problem are we solving for and who owns this? Looking towards vendors, no one stands alone anymore, especially in an ICS space. Your vendors are part of this. Think of it like a marriage. You're not just dating Siemens, Schneider, ABB, Emerson. These are people that are part of the solution with you. They need to be informed on what you're doing and what you're expecting from them. And last, all those who are joining us on this call today, the practitioners, the people investing in staff, ensuring adequate numbers, training, capabilities, tools, technology for them. All of that is going to be required for these controls to work.
Absolutely. So what can you expect to come next? 1, thank you for joining us today. Number 2, the white paper is going to get published when the video is posted, the recording. So at the end of this week or early next week, for those of you that are watching it as if it's posted already in the future, the white paper is already there. So the white paper will be on that ics.sans.org site. It'll also be linked in with this webinar. Tim and I are pretty passionate about this subject. It's been a lot of work culminating over the years to get here. So expect to see these 5 controls in our SANS classes. Expect us to be putting them out in posters and advocating out and follow-on webinars. We're also working with a number of organizations. If yours is interested, reach out, where they are going and implementing these 5 controls in order and then mapping to various standards out there. And they're going to publish case studies and white papers and SANS ICS Summit presentations and similar showing how they did this. Because if you're in electric transmission, it's not going to be wildly different than other electric transmission companies. If you're in paper and pulp, it's not going to be wildly different than other. So we're going to have the community members go, we did it. Here's how we did it, and provide playbooks and case studies for y'all to be able to implement and use. So there's a lot of follow-on content. We also have a webinar. If this is posted, you should be able to go to there as well. Coming up with CISA, so the Department of Homeland Security, published the Common Performance Goals, CPGs, for ICS and OT. We're going to have a webinar mapping those 5 to the CPGs and showing how they can work together. So Think of the 5 as the strategy, and then whatever framework or references as you want after as the thing that you map it to. And in our experience against ICS attacks and our experience teaching and working in the community for years now, these are really going to help you shape and focus without gold plating security programs to face our ICS adversaries and just the operational realities of complex industrial automation environments.
Thank you all for attending. We apologize. It took us a year to do this.
It took us like 10 to get here, but like a year to finish the paper. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much, Robert and Tim, for your great presentation. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.